in order to help everyone have a smooth connection today. Continue the conversation in the conference community on MS Teams and spark further conversations on social media using the hashtags WinRockE2A and Evidence to Action. Once again, you are at the session titled Referral Mechanisms and Victim Identification, Overcoming Barriers. We're now ready to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and hand over the floor to Natalie Hanley, Chief of Party for the Program Coordinator for Migrant Assistance and Counter-Trafficking Unit of IOM Thailand. Natalie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hamiz, and welcome everybody to this session. We have the privilege of being joined today by two very distinguished panelists with a long history in counter-trafficking. So I'm sure this will lead to some very rich discussions around the barriers that we face in victim identification and referral to services, as well as how to overcome those challenges. So without further ado, let me introduce the first panelist for this session, Her Excellency Chuban Eng. Her Excellency is the Secretary of State for the Ministry of Interior of Cambodia, as well as the Permanent Vice Chair of the National Committee for Counter-Trafficking in Persons of Cambodia. In this role, she is responsible for coordinating the interministerial government response to all counter-trafficking interventions in Cambodia. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And I'm Chuban Eng, Secretary of State of the Ministry of Interior Cambodia, and a permanent Vice Chairperson of the National Committee for Counter-Trafficking in Person. Thank you, USAID and WinRock for arranging this meeting. Please allow me to share experience in developing and implementing the national guidelines for victim identification and referral mechanism barriers in Cambodia. We have developed these guidelines since December 2015. Firstly, we may understand why victim identification is important. Because victims of trafficking in person often suffer physically, emotionally, sexually caused by perpetrators who exploit the legitimate interests of potential victims, impacting on their fundamental social and economic rights. Victims are in need of assistance, encouragement, and lawful compensation for the damage caused by such criminal offenders. Thus, if victims are not being clearly identified, they will not have the chance to receive fairly and equity assistance, and perpetrators will have the opportunity to commit more serious crime against victims and someone else. Other related offenses will not be found. The victim protection plan will not be responsive, and the commitment to eliminate the trafficking in person crime will be failed. So how to develop guidelines for victim of human trafficking identification? Due to the strong commitment of the royal government of Cambodia to combat human trafficking crime and to protect human rights, women's rights, and child rights in any circumstances, especially vulnerable people and victims of any crime, the royal government of Cambodia has ratified the UN Convention Against Transnational Crime and promulgated the law on approval the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in person, especially women and children, supplementing the UN Convention Against Transnational Crime in 2006. We have the national law to suppress human trafficking and sexual exploitation in 2008. We have bilateral and multilateral agreement and MOUs between relevant countries in the regions and internationally in combating trafficking in person. Being member of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration in 2018, tools developed for protecting victims of human trafficking, such as policy and minimum standard of protection of the rights of trafficked victims in 2009, and some other SOP with relevant countries. So what are the main purposes of the guidelines for victim identification? These guidelines is to provide a series of tasks and responsibility to various persons who contact suspect victims in taking account into them and to refer her or him or them to the assigned agent in charge of preliminary victim identification to ensure that the victims is able to receive first aid and appropriate services on time, and further services to protect them and give them chance to choose better way for developing themselves in better life circumstance and will not be able to collapse into victim again. Assigned agent include local authority, judicial police, social workers in charge of women and children affairs, staff and social affairs office or ministry, civil society staff who are working on victim protection, and all officials assigned by responsible for combating human trafficking. And finally, the decision of the judge after the prosecution procedure to see who is the victim. Those assigned agents who eligible, they undertaking preliminary victim identification shall receive prior training on forms, procedure, and methods to be used for victim identification, including physically and ethics for victim interview, trafficking, and in-person related law knowledge, communication skills, and any knowledge related to this job. To ensure that victims are safe and confident in giving enough real information to conclude that they are victim of trafficking in person or not, or any kind victim, so that they can refer them to appropriate services such as social, judicial, health, and others. So what are challenges during victim identification development process? We may aware that an inclusive manner from the stakeholders is required. They are different and they have their own tasks and policies in working with victims who are children, both girls and boys, women and men, and have different understanding and way of practices. They have different capacity to provide services and can cover limited target customers and areas. The data should be used together as a national data, while some organizations kept in confidentially and just for sharing with their donor. However, they have to fulfill the flow of procedures stated in the guidelines together to ensure that the data is not overlapped and exclusive. So how to solve these issues? This refers to the role and responsibility of the National Committee for Counter-Trafficking in Person, NCCT, which is the main coordinating body, and to facilitate the development process. NCCT led by the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of the Ministry of Interior, with 21 ministries and 5 special units as members, and structured down to the subnational level. NCCT assigned a General Secretariat led by the permanent Vice Chairperson, who is Secretary of State of the Ministry of Interior. In present is me. 6 ministers play the role as Vice Chairperson and lead 6 working groups, which focus on prevention, law enforcement, justice, victim protection, migration, and international cooperation. Governors of all provinces are delegated to lead subnational committee for counter-trafficking in person and set the same structure downstream to commune level. Local and international organizations, civil society are also partners in combating trafficking in persons in Cambodia. Thus, NCCT can gather inputs and facilitate among all stakeholders. And how to implement it. Every assigned agent has to fulfill their task and not allowed to exclude any victims or potential victims. Assigned agent has to obey key steps for victim identification together, so all related information and they can conclude correctly. At the interview stage, there are 3 steps. Firstly is initial stage or pre-interview. Secondly is commencement of the interview. And thirdly is the formal interview to collect information. Then make conclusion and referral the victims, the suspect victims. And we have to provide prior training in all aspects to assigned agent at national and subnational level and to assigned official and diplomatic mission to destination countries, both governor officials and civil society working on victim protection and services, as well as private recruitment agency. Judicial police has main mission to investigate more, to explore the crime affected victims and perpetrators to be suppressed. Social Affairs Office responsible for data collection, case management, and referral system to service providers, rehabilitation, and reintegration. So through the referral procedure chart outlining referral system, we can see the role of the Social Affairs Department and Judicial Police is very related, and any person who are aware they can contact the victim case can report and refer to assigned agent. And the Department of Social Affairs can make decision to refer the suspect victim to the service provision venue, such as health service, legal service, rehabilitation service, vocational training service, livelihood or employment service, educational service, etc. For the victims who are outside of the country, we have the diplomatic mission in destination countries, can report and repatriate them through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs International Cooperation to the Judicial Police Department in countries. And we still have challenges and solutions. Victims who need assistance are occur everywhere in and outside of the country. Assigned agents need to be trained. However, the step forward is remain slow due to resources and COVID-19 crisis. Assigned agents who are official staff are often changed due to their promotions. The number of social affairs officials and diplomatic mission and services provision are limited as compared with the number of victims who need assistance. As a solution, we may need more time to improve the implementation, to conduct monitoring and evaluation, and to strengthen services to respond to the needs of victims and trafficking in person. So I thank you so much and welcome your question or clarification, if any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for that extremely comprehensive presentation on the process of victim identification and referral in the context of Cambodia. I think it's very interesting to see how the process has been formalized with official guidelines and a formalized procedure, which helps to ensure that consistency that's really needed when it comes to victim identification and referral. For now, I'll encourage you to please, participants, submit any questions you might have in the chat. And in the meantime, we'll move to our second panelist for this session. So Archimedes Sigwan. Archimedes is the ASEAN Program Director for the ASEAN Australia Counter-Trafficking Program. And prior to this, also had a very long history of conducting law enforcement training for actors across the entire Asia region. He was an immigration official with the Philippine government, as well as Chief of Immigration for major Philippine international airports and an instructor at the Philippine Immigration Academy. So we're very much also looking forward to hearing his insights and his thoughts on this topic. Archimedes, over to you.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you so much to WinRAC and the organizers for the opportunity to speak before you today. First of all, I'd like to greet Her Excellency Chu Bon-eng. Your Excellency, good afternoon, and thank you so much for your presentation as well. I think I will no longer, my job is easier because Her Excellency has sort of laid down the foundations on what we want to talk about this afternoon. So I come in here as a writer of a paper entitled Survey and Assessment of Services for Victims of Human Trafficking, a Governance Perspective, a paper I did while studying, and the paper was, the locale of the paper was, is the Philippine setting. So my main thesis there was that I said that governance affects justice responses to trafficking in persons, including the identification of victims and the referral mechanism. I think the whole universe of the identification and referral mechanism lives in a governance system, both in the private sector, in the NGOs and CSO system, and in the governance of the public sector, of the government itself. Of course, we are aware as a community of advocates against trafficking in persons, we are aware that the crime tide continues its dynamism, resulting in the many challenges in the delivery of services. My paper investigated the justice and welfare sector services for trafficking victims in the Philippines using a governance lens. In that, I asked the questions of what are the barriers in the delivery and access to services. I also surveyed different anti-trafficking actors to map out the different services for victims of trafficking and the actors that provide them. In this study, I found that the Philippines has a comprehensive array of services available to victims of trafficking, just like any other ASEAN member state or any other countries signatory to the Palermo Protocol, and also to the ASEAN member states who are signatory to the ASEAN Convention on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. Generally, I think also as in any other country, the services are sufficient, they are responsive, they conform to the intent of a robust legal framework and directive international instruments. My paper also found that the biggest barrier is not the unavailability of services, but the delivery of and access to these services. On the part of the service providers, of course, there are barriers, political barriers, the capacity barriers, including the barriers in the organizations themselves, with people, law enforcers, service providers, duty bearers being reassigned from one post to another from time to time, leaving behind a vacuum of service in their office once they go out of their offices and they are reassigned to another post, for example. And just that is just one example. On the part of the victims, on the other hand, what was surprising to me was that disincentives abound for the victims. That means that for the victims, it is to remain in the referral mechanism once they are identified as victims of trafficking. To remain in the recovery path in that governance system is very cumbersome for that victims. We have heard of victims telling duty bearers that they would rather go home, go back to their homes, be with their families, be with their kids, with their husbands, rather than remain in the shelter. And there are also problems with closed shelters. Victims wanting to go home, but unable to go home despite wanting to go out of the shelters. I think there are very real questions on how long can government shelters or even NGO shelters keep victims inside those shelters, even without their consent. And there are also questions that we need to consider if adult victims are, of course, adult victims are differently situated than child victims. But once child victims are being sought out by their parents, by their relatives, Do government shelters continue to hold them off and not release them to their relatives? These questions. Victims prefer to opt out of the recovery and the reintegration responses of anti-trafficking actors because the system itself does not offer more acceptable options. There are services available, but the delivery of these services may be challenging. For instance, while legal framework will say that financial support need to be provided, but financial support may be insufficient. So victims may be surprised to see that these financial support is insufficient, and they would rather go back to some work. They would look for employment rather than stay in that government mandated rehabilitation center, for instance. Responsive medical services would also need to be re-examined, and constant protection for victims who remain in the system and pursue the legal means against their traffickers. In this paper, I had a number of recommendations, but I suppose we are going to go into the recommendations later, correct, Nathalie?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. And for now, I'd like to end by saying, while there are barriers in the delivery of services for victims, and there are barriers in the delivery of duty by duty bearers and responders, I remain to be optimistic that as a community, both the government and the private sector have already started to converse about the issues on victim identification and the referral mechanism. And over to you, Nathalie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Archimedes, for that really interesting kind of oversight of your research and your findings. I think it's very interesting for us to hear from your perspective and perspective of the counter-trafficking actors you spoke with on the kind of barriers for victims to actually avail of the services that exist, and the fact that maybe the incentives really aren't there for them to enjoy those services. So I think that's a really interesting kind of a look at some of the challenges that exist. I've seen some of the questions starting to come in already, and I'll encourage you to keep, please, participants, sharing your questions in the chat. Maybe I'll start off with a question both for Your Excellency Chu Bon-eng, as well as for you, Archimedes. You both in your presentations touched on this issue of staff, qualified, trained staff rotating and the turnover, and also the lack of financial resources to continuously be doing training. This is, of course, a very significant barrier. Maybe you could tell me a little bit from your perspective what you think can be done to address this particular challenge. And maybe perhaps I'll pass over to Her Excellency first, and then to Archimedes for some inputs on this question.
Yeah. I would like to add something regarding to the gender equality and social inclusion, metric or tools. You see, according to the victims who are female or male, we have actually we have the same guidelines for identification or support them, but as for men or for male, victims. Most of them, they do not want to stay at the shelter, and they remain, go home, and sometimes, they do not wait, for the process of investigation procedure or the prosecution procedure, because it takes time, until they can define the victimization, the activity committed by the perpetrator. And sometimes they do not recognize that they are victims of trafficking in persons, or recognize that the one who commit a crime against them as the perpetrator, because the trick, of the perpetrator is different. from one to another. Sometimes they understand that the perpetrator just assists them and not commit crime against them. And for the female victims, they mostly, respect, the a guideline, and sometimes they just stay at the shelter, but we can say that the shelter is limited, it's not for everyone. So sometimes we just send them to the community by reintegration and just to support them for a livelihood or the job provision, and they can stay, close by their children, and just some of them just stay at the shelter. And for the children, mainly send them to the educational activity, and sometimes just provide the informal education, and sometimes just integrate them into the formal schools. So we think that we accept and we agree that the challenge is not only by the lack of economic support or something, but sometimes, they cannot wait, for the process for, in the assisting them. For example, send them to the vocational training, which takes 3 months or 6 months before they getting job, and they can say that they do not have enough time, to stay with us, and they just would like to do something to survive. And so sometimes the protection or the support is really challenging. And so many victims, of the labor exploitation, sometimes they just back, back to the job, and they will face another crime again. Even they have experience that they face once again, the risk, but they still, try their best to go back to the place, and then they will face a lot of the problem again. So that's the challenge we still have right now. So I think that we do not have the something more effective strategy in our plan yet, because we just try to start it, and we still in the process of implementation. And we just try to conduct the monitoring and evaluation, and we can see how we can improve the activity. And right now we can say that the prosecution process will be paced more faster, and the Ministry of Justice and the judge have the reform, the judicial reform. So we just hope that the prosecution process will be more shorter than before, so can solve the problem a bit,
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your inputs and your insights on this point. I think you responded also to some of the things that our committees raised in his presentation, talking about the challenges in keeping victims of trafficking engaged in the support that the government can offer, and outlining really the opportunity costs for victims to participate in vocational training initiatives or support mechanisms, rather than beginning to work again and earning income. So this is really a very big challenge, I think, that counterparts do face. And maybe our committees, if I could ask you again, because this relates to your presentation, to give us kind of your perspective on what might be some challenges, some solutions to this particular challenge. I saw that participants in the chat have been discussing the opportunity of community-based supporting services, and this is also something that Her Excellency mentioned in her comments just now. with questions the participants have been putting about how can we ensure access to services when victims are home and they're not staying in a shelter environment. So Archimedes, if maybe you can share some of your perspectives on that question, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Nathalie. And first of all, congratulations to Cambodia, Your Excellency. I think you are on the right path towards institutionalizing a system of a good victim identification and referral system. On the questions of Nathalie and also the questions posed on the chat box, on the challenges and how to address them, I think we must go tackle a very fundamental question in victim identification leading to recovery and reintegration is the question of taxonomy. The question of taxonomy in the victim identification process. In the first instance, we need to ask, who is a trafficking victim? And in many jurisdictions, a trafficking victim is not even defined in their counter-trafficking laws. Of course, there are trafficking laws that define trafficking victim. For instance, the ASEAN Convention on Trafficking in Person defines a victim as a natural person who is subject to an act of trafficking in persons, as defined in the convention. But that is, for me, a very vague definition on who a victim is. So we need to apply the term more victim friendly, if I may say so, that there is a problem of taxonomy in victim identification because, first of all, we are not sure as a community on who really is a victim. I think we need to lower the threshold in defining on who a victim is. First of all, who will define a victim of trafficking as a victim of trafficking in persons? Shall we wait for law enforcers to say that a particular person is a victim of trafficking? Or will a determination by an NGO, for instance, by a social worker, not even a government social worker, be sufficient to identify a victim as a victim of trafficking, and therefore could receive the services for victims of trafficking and be on the pathway to recovery? Next, second, we also need to lower the threshold in the services for victims of trafficking in persons. And services for trafficking in persons should not be made contingent on their willingness and their ability to participate in the criminal justice process. In this instance, I think some jurisdictions are too fixated on measuring success by terms of a successful prosecution of a trafficking case, which for me misses the whole point of a victim-centered approach to trafficking in persons. If a service for victims of trafficking is made contingent on their participation in the criminal justice process, I think it leads to a path of re-victimization, right? Because many victims will be asked to retell their stories, go in front of a judge, go in front of a court and retell their stories to law enforcers. There's, of course, no problem with victims continuing to go after their traffickers via the criminal justice sector. But what if the victim does not want to do that? If the victim does not want to participate in the criminal justice process, will he still be considered as a victim of trafficking? In some jurisdictions, it does not happen. It is there in legislations. Of course, it is there. But victims who do not participate does not receive as much, if I may say so, as the victims who participate in the criminal justice process, in the court process, to run after their traffickers. I think, Nathalie, and Your Excellency, we may want to redefine our success in our approaches against trafficking. Let's say, what if being able to identify a victim as a victim of trafficking and being able to provide the services for that victim, even outside the criminal justice process, is already a success of trafficking? And we do not have to necessarily count the number of prosecutions, number of people rescued by law enforcers, but other actors in the community and service providers, jury bearers who could help as well. let us count those cases as successful cases in dealing with trafficking in persons. So simply by lowering the threshold of victimization, once all the elements of trafficking are present, then we can say that we have at least saved one victim from exploitation. And then we can have a bespoke system of assistance for these victims. Of course, we have the pre-return, return services, and post-return services that can be made available for victims once they are identified. But the very fundamental question of who is a victim and when they can avail of these services is already problematic. But again, I am an optimist, Natalie, and we have already started these conversations. I think we are on the right path.
Thank you so much for that input. I think you've really hit the nail on the head in terms of how that official identification is made and what is necessary for it to be made in order the victims can start receiving and availing of services that exist. And I think it's very interesting the point you raise about in many jurisdictions still it being contingent upon participation in criminal justice procedures, which might exclude a large number of potential victims from receiving services. This question about how do you define a victim of trafficking, I think is also interesting, and it's one of the questions that came up in the chat when we're looking at a mutual recognition of victims across different countries and different borders. And maybe I wanted to turn this question over to Her Excellency Chubanang, who I'm sure has a lot of experience on this matter. How does it work? What kind of challenges have you experienced in the Cambodian context where maybe you've recognized the Cambodian national as a victim, but the country of destination has not? And how do you overcome those types of challenges?
For us, we can find a lot of victims, but not all are victims of trafficking in person. Until we can identify them based on the definition of the trafficking in person crime, stated in the law, and as well as in the protocol of trafficking in person. So if we can find, the composition of the victim of the trafficking in persons crime, then this victim is the victim of trafficking in persons. But for identification of victim, it does mean that we can call them as a suspected victim, and we just provide them first aid, and we can continue to investigate more deeper to find the crime, and if we can find the crime, we can find the perpetrator, and we can send the case to the court, and the court can make decision. But at least we can call them a suspect victim, and we provide assistance beforehand, because on the process of prosecution, we take time. So we have to identify them as suspected victim and provide them support and any services for them.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for that input. One of the comments that also came through in the chat about victim identification is working with nationals or migrants who might not have been formally identified as victims of trafficking yet, but who might be vulnerable to trafficking, and engaging them as a preventive measure. And I think both in the context of the Philippines and Cambodia, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs also has very robust consular screening for nationals looking to travel abroad, so that if there are any indications that they might be at risk of being trafficked, there can be interventions made. What are your thoughts about this type of preventive victim identification and working with populations that might be vulnerable to trafficking? Do you think there are some good examples that we can share? Do you think there's more work that needs to be done in this sector? Maybe Archimedes, if you can give us your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, Nathalie. I think we will all agree that any effort to prevent trafficking or a preventive measure would really be helpful in any rights-based and victim-centered approach in the space that where we work. And one of the important things that I see in there is access. In terms of prevention of victimization, prevention of trafficking, access to resources for victims, so that even if, say, if they are not officially identified as victims of trafficking, maybe they can self-identify as victim. And even if they are, if some victims may be hesitant to come forward, report or self-report, or seek the help of social workers, of law enforcers, and other duty bearers, just the fact of the resources being made available to them could perhaps encourage them to seek these resources. If there is access, if doors are open to some victims, then they may come forward and seek the help. And again, I hope that these resources are made available even for victims which are not officially identified as such, and even for victims that will only self-identify, and perhaps with some help from, say, social work practitioners. And this can then prevent further victimization. And that then can lift them out of any exploitative situation. There are model community-based approaches that we have seen in the ASEAN region. For example, foster care of families in communities, not only going into shelters. There are also employment-based support for not only for victims officially identified as victims, but for those who are vulnerable. And then again, we have a problem. We might have a problem of taxonomy on who do we say are vulnerable to trafficking in persons. In our laws, in the legislation, I think we have the provision of exploitation of the vulnerability of persons, and I hope in the victim identification process, this exploitation of the vulnerability of others can feed in to that process, so that once there are people who are vulnerable, they could already avail of any rights-based approach and services for victims. I think in this way also, we can strengthen the pathways other than the prosecution, so that other than criminal justice response, so that we have a pathway towards reintegration and recovery that will not involve any formal identification, but just the recognition of a vulnerability, and then provided them with the access to services for victims. Natalie.
Thank you very much for that. One of the things, in our discussions, we've been talking about being formally identified in order to access services. But it's clear also in Cambodia, across countries in Asia, there's a very active civil society body who also provide services to victims of trafficking, to potential victims of trafficking. Your Excellency, it's something also that you mentioned in your presentation. And one of the challenges also that the government faces, because oftentimes civil society organizations might provide assistance to victims of trafficking who might be hesitant or reluctant to go to seek formal support from the government. But then that means that the government maybe doesn't always have comprehensive information or data about the trafficking profile in the country. Your Excellency, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit from your perspective what your thoughts are about how we can move forward on this question. How can civil society organizations who work with victims respect their wish not to be formally referred to government, respect their right to data privacy, protection, confidentiality, but also still be sharing that information that you from government need in order to have a comprehensive understanding of the trafficking profile in your country?
Yeah, thank you so much. For Cambodia, we put aside the NGO as partner. And we can say that no one can solve the social problem alone. That is why the government and the organization, the NGO, civil society, we work together. and we can fulfill each other. We just want to set up the guidelines to implement at the same process so that we can identify or we can collect the data easily. And so far, you know, we work separately from NGO and government. And I think that is not a benefit to us and to the victims' support. That is why right now we work together, and sometimes, you know, we refer the victim to the NGO services, but sometimes we also integrate them into the community. And there, you know, we have the local authority, we have the whereas the institutions can assist together. For example, right now, you know, the returnee from the destination country, especially from Thailand during COVID-19, we integrate them into the community and we assist them there. And some organizations who have the specialists, you know, on the livelihood or vocational training can provide them, or education in the survival activity. They can provide them at the community. And the government also provide them job placement or employment, and sometimes we also can create, you know, some jobs for surviving. So I think that if we work together, we can gain more rather than just try to separate the task from a government and NGO. That is why, you know, within the guidelines, we try to cooperate, you know, the input from both sides and also from the private sector as well, you know, because the victim is under the responsibility of any partners. So I think that the role of government and the civil society is combining and collaborating and supplementing each other. Yeah, and we cannot separate from each other, just partners.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think it's really like warming to see kind of your position and your attitude towards this cooperation between government and non-government actors. I think you're right that it is so critical to make sure that we can be offering this diversity of services and really this more tailored approach that's needed in providing victim-centered services. And I think, you know, that's also something that came across really in our committee's presentation. It is that need for diverse services that respond to the individual needs of victims, whether that's in a shelter environment or in a community environment. And you touched also in your kind of inputs just now on the role of the private sector as well. And that's also something that I think in the international community, we're starting to be more mindful of and thinking about how to engage also this actor in our discussions around victim identification and referral. And especially in the context of COVID-19, where, you know, we're all facing many challenges, including maybe some financial challenges with resources being reprioritized to support the COVID-19 response. It's really important to have that kind of coordination and that cooperative framework, and to avoid kind of duplicating services and work more harmoniously together. We have a final 5 minutes, so I think I'm going to ask one question, and I'll ask it both firstly to our committees and then also to Your Excellency for your inputs. And it is on COVID-19, because we can't avoid that question in this time. So with COVID-19, there have been all of these mobility restrictions in place, all of these lockdowns that have made victim identification so difficult at the moment. But we also know that because of COVID-19 and because of the economic consequences, people are more vulnerable to trafficking because people are more desperate, people are more likely to accept abusive and exploitative working conditions or to put themselves in harm's way. What needs to change for us to be more effective at identifying victims in this context? Our committees, maybe if you can give me your thoughts first, and then I'll hand over to Her Excellency for her thoughts on this question.
Yes, thank you so much, Nathalie. I am happy to defer to Her Excellency to give the final words in our session. But first of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. And on COVID-19 and trafficking, I think we all agree that vulnerabilities may have been exacerbated by virtue of the restrictions and the effect to the world of work. And that I think we cannot deny. And researchers will have for years a great material for study. And we need more empirical data, empirical study on what really the effects are on trafficking in persons in COVID-19. But as to the responses of the trafficking, anti-trafficking community during this time, and I think I would like to end by saying I commend all our fellow workers in the counter-trafficking sector for continuing to find ways and continuing to be adaptive during this time, because I have law enforcement friends who have risked the infection by rescuing victims of trafficking even during this time. And I have personally seen it, and I've personally seen operations where law enforcement officers continue to do their job in the PPEs they have, and it is not very easy. And trafficking, COVID-19 has made even more difficult the duty of our responders to trafficking. There are additional risks that are involved. Not only the existing risks to trafficking, but also health risks and safety risks to our trafficking responders. So I think I would like to end by saying that thank you to our fellow workers in the community for continued doing their job, for being adaptive, responsive during this time. Nathalie.
Thank you very much, Archimedes, and I think we can all agree with that sentiment as well. Your Excellency, in the context of Cambodia, what are the challenges that you faced with COVID-19 in victim identification, and what's needed to overcome those challenges?
You see, I think that everywhere, we face the problem of COVID-19 crisis, and it is damage. But I think that it's also give the chance to change the world. And right now, due to the lack of employment or the returning of the migrant workers back home, more than 100,000. Right now, we we face a problem, but it seems like we can provide them the behavior change education to be more care, more responsible, and how to protect themselves from risk or vulnerability, and also how to survive the place where they are, rather than just try to move back and forth, because right now the restriction of the border closed, it seems like the barrier, but sometimes it can also be keep them to be stable and think and change their mindset, their behavior, and they can also stay with their family, close to their children. And I think that sometimes it's also helpful. And I think that it's also the time to review, the policies or the regulation that we have, what we call the gap so far, So I think that if we can take this time to do so, I think that it's helpful. So I would like to say lastly that thank you very much to all partners to assist us, and the country partners as well, because they are the destination and we are the sending country. So we can collaborate with each other to take care of our people. And even we have faced a problem against the COVID-19 or the trafficking in person, but I think that the restriction of the movement of the people can also keep the people in the place, and the trafficking in person can be reduced a bit for me, you know, for my my thought, you know. Try to have some more restriction for the perpetrator who bring, you know, the migration back and forth. Thank you so much for giving me time.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I can imagine it was a really huge challenge having to provide support. You mentioned 100,000 migrant workers returning out of work from overseas. So these are really some difficult issues. Our committee is as well touching on the health risks that law enforcement officers faced when going in to provide that kind of immediate rescue and assistance to victims of trafficking. And both of you touched upon, you know, some ways that we can move forward, whether that's through research to better understand really what are the challenges that are emerging around COVID-19 in terms of trafficking in persons, you know, being more adaptive. You mentioned also, Your Excellency, looking at policies and how policy needs to change in light of these new circumstances. So, you know, it's a lot of work for all of us. You mentioned also providing information to potential victims of trafficking to make better choices and more informed choices about migration. And I think that's going to be very critical moving forward when borders do start to open, because the economic impacts are going to be with us for a long time still. So really, I wanted to thank both of you, both of our panelists, for sharing with all of us your experience, your thoughts, your wisdom. It was really appreciated. Thank you also to all of the participants who are very active in the chat. It was hard for me to keep up with all of the questions and to listen to the panelists as well, but I did my best. Thank you very much as well to Winrock, to USAID for putting in place this session and the whole evidence summit. I'll hand over back now to Hermes, our technical facilitator. Thank you very much again to all of you.
Thank you, Nathalie.
Thank you, everyone, for attending the Evidence to Action Summit and today's session. Our next and final sessions will take place this evening, beginning in just under 4 hours from now. They are titled Rethinking Reintegration at 8 p.m. Bangkok time, followed immediately by our closing session, Main Key Takeaways, and Next Steps at 9 p.m. Remember that there is a $50,000 pitch competition being offered to registrants of this summit. Be sure to find out more on the website or on the conference community on Microsoft Teams. Proposals featuring new partnerships formed at the summit are prioritized and applications are due at the end of the month. You will be able to connect with potential collaborators and partners on the conference community. Thank you again so much for your participation. Have a wonderful day wherever you are in the world.